Hey, Pentax Tips here, and today we will be shooting an ISO comparison test between the K3 Mark III and the K1 Mark I.
We recognize that this will be a subjective test, and there are other ways to test the differences between full frame and APS-C. But for this test, we'll just be looking at first glance results.
We have actually completed a similar test between the K70 and the K3 Mark III. Please see our link in the description for that comparison video. For this video, I will be doing the image acquisition.
And both of us will be analyzing the images in post-production.
Let's get started. We'll run through this test using the 100mm macro WR lens and systematically take photos of these flowers at full stop ISOs starting with the K1. We've pre-metered our scene to allow for the K1's highest ISO of 204,800, keeping the image exposed without going over our max shutter speed of 1/8,000th of a second, and adding a little headroom. Going through the settings, we have no dynamic range corrections, no ISO corrections, and no in-lens corrections applied. We're using a 2-second timer, saving .dngs. We should be able to see the raw output from the first series K1 sensor. I'll speed this part up, and we're all done. Let's move on to the APS-C K3 Mark III. Just double checking that we have all the same settings, no dynamic range correction, no ISO correction, and no lens corrections. Saving .dngs, let's rip through this.
Welcome to post-production. I'll be stepping through each image ISO, pairing with the K3 on the left and the K1 on the right. First, a quick comment on what we're looking for here. The K1 35mm equivalent sensor size is much larger than the K3 Mark III APS-C cropped sensor. It follows then that the scene is substantially different between the two images. So please remember, we're not really comparing the scene of the image, it's more about the quality of the ISO at first glance, both zoomed out and zoomed to 100%. At ISO 100, the zoom out images are perfectly clean, and the same goes for zoomed in. The focusing is a little different between the two images, but that's not really a problem for just an ISO test. Let's continue.
ISO 200 looks pretty much the same as ISO 100. Not too much to comment on here other than that it's looking pretty clean.
ISO 400 is looking much the same as 200. No real noise coming through yet.
ISO 800 shows ever so slight amount of noise across the image, still not enough to steal my attention.
At ISO 1600, the slight bit of noise has caught my attention, but only when zoomed in. I would probably want to use a little bit of noise reduction to clean up the shadows, especially if I'm going to be cropping this image. However, I feel both images are still quite equal in terms of the amount of noise.
At ISO 3200, it still looks like both images are handling their ISO noise well while zoomed out. And while maybe just starting to see it creep into the shadows a little bit, it's not really noticeable and there is no distinct color noise. Zoomed in, both images exhibit a mild noisy grain across the image. Sharpness and colors are well maintained, and this could still be a usable image. But I'll be using noise reduction to clean up that distracting grain. The quality of the noise between the two cameras still seems to be about equal.
ISO 6400 shows a slightly more noticeable dash of noise zoomed out across both images. I would want to apply a noise reduction tool if I want to use this zoomed out image, just to clean up the shadows. Zoomed in, my first impression is that the sharpness is taking a slight hit across both images. The noise is quite noticeable, and post-production tools would definitely be needed for a cropped scene. Still, I feel the quality of noise is about equal.
At ISO 12,800, both images display noise zoomed out and would need a reduction tool to clean up both images, especially in the shadows. Still pretty impressive, however, and if cleaned up, both images could be workable in the zoomed out version. Zoomed in, sharpness is taking a bit of a hit and the noise is prominent. It would take a pretty decent dose of post-production tools to clean up this image for a cropped use. Impressively, both images seem to be very comparable.
At ISO 25,600, zoomed out, we see noise throughout both images, and post-production cleanup would save the image if you really needed it. Zoomed in, although sharpness is noticeably taking a hit on both images, we begin to see a substantial divergence between the ISO qualities. It appears that noise is starting to affect the exposure of the K1 images. However, especially in the shadows, the K1 shows a better retention of dynamic range. I'm still seeing a relatively smoother transition in color depth on the K1, while the K3 Mark III starts to look a bit blockier. At this point, I would want to give a slight edge to the K1, despite the slight exposure issue.
At ISO 51200, both images are fairly noisy zoomed out, but still relatively equal. A strong dose of noise reduction would be required to make the noise less distracting. Zoomed in, we are still seeing further degradation of the sharpness with both images, but the K1 seems slightly worse with a continued issue with the exposure being snowy. It may just be the exposure issue, but I am definitely seeing better dynamic range with more color gradation in the K1. However, in the K3 Mark III's defense, color saturation and exposure is definitely being better maintained.
At ISO 102,400, we have a substantial amount of noise displayed even while zoomed out, and in particular, the noise affecting the exposure on the K1. However, I'm tempted to say that the K1 has retained a touch more sharpness than the K3, but with the noticeable issue with exposure and noise, it's definitely hard to appreciate that extra sharpness. I still maintain that the dynamic range is better on the K1, displaying deeper shadows and a higher level of color gradation.
Our last ISO comparison is at ISO 204,800, and the zoomed out images are substantially different. The K1 has turned into a complete snowstorm, and the exposure is being heavily impacted by noise. The K3 Mark III is noisy zoomed out, but could still probably be used in an emergency with some noise reduction tools. Zoomed, the K1 really shows that exposure problem with the snowstorm we keep referring to. It's not really a salvageable image. While the K3 isn't really impressive either, you can at least say that it has retained its exposure and color better than the K1.
And there we have it. Thanks for watching this first glance comparison video. Let us know what you think of the results in the comments below. If you like this content and you'd like to see more like it, please remember to like and subscribe. Thanks!